Belated happy 2026, everybody who's out there. It took me a few days to think about what I wanted to say today, and I still don't know that I have it all dialed in, but given that it's actually a nice day with sun, I thought this would be a good day to go ahead and do it. I'm calling this, I think I've decided to call it Walking Away from the Good Girl Program. And it's come about a little bit because I've had a few interactions lately where it feels like, well, let me start with the good side of things. We had a great New Year's celebration. It was pretty quiet. I've still been getting over a cold, which I'm just taking as like my body saying, just chill, sit back and be in your house and be cozy and get things tidied up and clear out the clutter and be prepared for the year. So it's all been good and I'm feeling better. But I didn't really do much. I mean, I had some, invitations for New Year's, but I just stayed quiet. I've been sewing a lot. I made this dress, which is nice, with like leftover linen from my cloak project. And I made an owl for a friend in the spring. And I was like, oh, these are great. So I cut out a whole bunch more. And then I promptly let them sit in the sewing room while I did gardening all summer and fall. So now I'm getting back to the owls, and this one I'm making this one for my mom, and so she doesn't watch my podcast, so I can show it to you. It's a belated Christmas present. I'm hoping to take it to her in the next month or so. So I've been creative, I've been a homebody, I've been sort of just reflecting. Star Ripperetti of the Star Portal, she had folks over for just like a New Year's Day bonfire, and she made black-eyed peas with her star essences, and there were just a few of us, but I had made those flags with the hearts, and so I hung them up all in the trees, and they look phenomenal. And then some of us, we've been making these little clothespin flower fairies, and with felt and roving and markers and glitter, and so we hung those all up in the woods too with the heart flags, and we just set a really good intention. And we still have the chestahedron that my friend Gigi made, and so I meditated a little bit in the chestahedron about things to let go and things to bring in, and it was so nice to sit and listen to the creek, Glazy Po Creek, flowing by, and just like envisioning the things that you want to let go, just letting them flow gently down the creek, and then the things that you'd like to bring in, let them come in, again, with grace. And so I did that, and I did the things I wanted to let go, I wrote them all down, and I put that in the bonfire. And so it worked last year. And so I'm hoping, and the things I wanted to bring in, I kept that sheet, and I have it under my friend Gigi made me a little chestahedron. So it's out there in the front, and it was all good. And Star's black-eyed peas were awesome. And then, so that was middle of the week. And then on Saturday, we had our twice a month meditation, sort of love meditation, which is really just like a way of checking in with everybody, and everyone just goes around the circle and says how they're doing. And if they have people that they want to sort of put in the circle who need a little bit of extra attention or prayers, and people just had like such good things to offer. And my friend Zavi was talking about her angels and her linebacker angels holding the line, and just we should, introducing us to the linebacker angels if we have situations where we need linebacker angels, and cheerleader angels who will kick you in the butt if you need it or cheer you on. And so that was great. And then my other friend, who's sort of my mentor in the heart forgiveness, she had been away for a lot of the fall, out of state, and came back and was just really talking about her connection to the community that we have, and just describing that this is a place where you can feel safe and celebrated. Like not just safe, but safe and celebrated. And I thought that was just such a beautiful way of putting it. And, I have a little bit of a twinge in my heart because I feel like it's not the default for the world right now, is that we feel safe and celebrated for who we are and all of our diversity. And so anyway, I like centering that idea, I wanted to take a minute and explain a little bit about, if people who've been following my journey, they're like, oh my gosh, well, the last few years, she's really talking about nothing particularly helpful or specific, because she had all this detailed information about mapping and the bad guys and what was happening and what was unfolding. And then her life fell apart and she rebuilt. And now she's telling other kinds of stories, and we really don't know what it's talking about. It involves like felt birds and fairies in the forest. And we don't, maybe people don't know what that's about. And I didn't really expect to take this journey either. And I'm not here to say, like, write you a prescription and say, I've got it all figured out. Like, here, sign up for my webinar and I'll tell you how to, like, do life. That's not it. But there is something that I'm supposed to do, I think, that involves sharing my walk in the case that maybe there's some parts of what how I'm interfacing with the world that will offer you some tools for your journey. And so, and if it doesn't, that's fine. That's fine. So I'm not here to like tell anybody they're doing it wrong and I'm doing it right, because I really don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just doing and doing it publicly. But maybe you'll find some helpful things. And so I'm calling this like stepping away from the Good Girl program, because I've mentioned, if you follow my work in the past, I'm in my late 50s. My grandparents were children in the Depression. And then they were young adults during World War II. And the collective trauma of that scarcity and fear, I think the more I'm spending time on resonance and topology and frequency and time cycles, like that got installed into that generation. And both of my grandfathers, they were alcoholics, and that was their way of coping with the fear, I think, of and trying to reconnect with reality that didn't really make sense anymore. And so then my parents found each other, right? Both children of alcoholics, and they were going to make it better. And, in a large part, they really did. But, and they were first generation college and, climbing the ladder of corporate America, successfully. And I have a younger brother. And as it turned out over time, our dynamics, like our archetypal dynamics in the family, was like, I was the rule follower and my brother was like the not rule follower, not in a terrible way, but like he was definitely more pushing back and I was more like, how high can I jump? And it wasn't like anyone told us to be those things. It just we just showed up that way. And and now over time, I realize my brother and I are very, very similar. So that was just for that phase of our lives. But I spent some time looking at, not deeply, but like the human design and the gene key stuff. And there's part of me that's like, I'm not a super joiner in anything that's popular. I'm often like, I don't know. But I'm also interested in new tools for the toolbox. And the more I understand archetypes and things, the more I realize like, wow, there's something to that. There's something to these information fields that exist outside us, and mathematical alignment. Arthur Young's work has been super fascinating for me. And so, I looked at just sort of the surface level of both of those two things. Enabling constraints. You come in with these structures. It doesn't mean everything is decided, but these are the trends you have to work with, right? Like this is sort of your starting point and what you're bumping up against. And this is your game board. Welcome to your game board. And shocker, maybe in the human design, I guess, it's all about different centers. It's not quite chakras, but it's different parts that activate different things and in different parts of your body. And they talk about like things that are either always available to you or intermittently available or not available. And in my chart, essentially everything is here. It's like my two fixed centers are my mind, the brain, and the anja. So, and everything else is open. Everything is open. And I'm a mental projector and a martyr heretic with a right angle cross of consciousness. And so essentially what that means is I don't really have inner authority. I have to talk things out with people. And I'm really susceptible to other people's programs because this is all empty. And I'm always like busy thinking, talking, imagining, questioning up here, which is kind of disconnected from reality. So I'm bumbling around in the world as a kid and I'm picking up programs, right? And so then you end up being like, how high can I jump? What do I need to do to get the A? Like, I mean, I wasn't a brown noser, but I was always, and my parents didn't expect it. It wasn't like someone was like lecturing me on how to be that way. I just absorbed it. I'm like, okay, we're climbing the ladder. What does this look like? How can I help? And I did that and I took all of that on. And my brother's like, no thanks, and now we've met around the backside. But in that space, I realized, when I first started doing my videos, you can go back and look, and I would always say, I'm a mother and I'm a public school parent. And so because of the big shift in breaking my model of reality, And I've lately been super interested in Carl Friston's work on the free energy principle and active inference, and that the way we work as systems, embodied systems, is that we have a model of the world that we work from, and mostly we're on autopilot, and then we have certain inputs that maybe don't make sense to the model, and then we have to either revise the model or resample and stay in our niche. And we don't even think that we're doing that. And it's something from as basic of like, I'm thirsty, I think I'll go to the fridge and get a glass of water, to something much bigger, right? And so the thing that broke the model in 2020, was shutting down the world. And so then all of us were trying to figure out like, whoa, this has never happened before. What does, how do we revise the model, and what is the story that we're stepping into? And the reverberations of that continue. And I think at this point, they're continuing not because the things that were so shocking at the time have repeatedly reoccurred. We're mostly still reliving that trauma, however you experience the trauma. We're living in that space, and we do it to ourselves. And we're living because we're projecting what might happen forward, not like what's actually happening in the moment. So public school parent. So I adopted the program. I was good in public school. I thought that this is what the United States was, and that we were the good guys, and like later on it's like, oh, Star Wars, United States, you think that you're, Luke Skywalker, but you're actually maybe you're Darth Vader, right? That's like a reality tunnel flip. And then you have to like process all that and figure out when you come on the other side, like, where are you standing? And so the thing that flipped the world for me was 2013, Boston Consulting Group closed down 23 public schools in Philadelphia, destabilized neighborhoods, families, kids, teachers, laid off 3,000 teachers. 4 months later, they roll out a school report card to start grading these schools that they violently disassembled. And then charter schools were treated differently. And so I was like, okay, I didn't realize that the world was actually like this, but I'm going to fight that bad thing that happened. There was a bad thing that happened, and it's my responsibility as a person with privilege to step up in this world and make this case known that this was the bad thing. And so I did, and I did that for like 10 or 11 years. And I did it because I had adopted this program of being the good public school student. Not that it's bad to be a good public school student, but I didn't even know it was a program or that it was my program. And so that's the space that I lived in. And then the public meetings about it got shut down and turned into focus groups. And then the Dell Foundation came. And then that was the beginning of my teasing apart, pulling the threads, telling stories about what I thought was happening based on these very comprehensive maps that I had made, which I'm very good at, because guess what? I'm all here, right? I'm really good at patterns. That's the thing. It says like, you have to repeat patterns. Your whole life is about patterns. So so I was finding patterns and I was telling stories. And in doing that, it unraveled my model terrifically, but it unraveled my model in ways that I realized later on. And this was happening around, again, 2013. So 7-8 years later, the world changes again in this other lens, but I can totally see how a similar playbook is in place. But all of those people have no awareness of my world model or what I've gone through, and they're living in a different story. And I'm trying to shout through across the boundary about, hey, this is relevant, about impact finance and cybernetics and social systems, but it never hit because they were in another very specific story based around their trauma. Like, so that what I was a public school parent, and and at this point it's still kind of painful because my adult child, like, we haven't been in touch for almost like 4 or 5 years. It's a long time. And this is part of one of the hard lessons that I think I was here to learn, was the idea that I had to become a different person. Because I'm like, no, I'm the good person. I'm fighting the good fight. I'm standing up for these values that are embodied in the United States and public civic participation. And I'm being the little guy versus the big guy. And I'm doing the good thing. And I was that warrior for the good thing. And I think many of us in this idea of the active inference, in addition to the world model, Chris Fields, he has been researching the idea of applying quantum information theory and integrating it into active inference and the free energy principle. And so his idea is that essentially we exist as systems in quantum superposition, and we're interacting with other systems, and those systems can be other people or institutions or objects. And there's a boundary at that space where we're interacting, and quote unquote reality kind of projects from the superposition space onto the boundary, and then that's where what we call reality exists, which to me corresponds a lot with what I've been looking into in terms of like projective geometry and holography, is that maybe there's just the reality is how these different systems are interpenetrating. And which I find super fascinating, because at this point, like, I'm not so much about figuring out good guys and bad guys. I just want to know how it works, because I've had these situations where it's something I thought was good and then I was standing up and being a warrior for. When I eventually had a more nuanced, sophisticated understanding of it, I probably wouldn't have fought for it, right? I at this point, I was good at public school and I fought for public schools, but I don't know that that's the thing that the hill that I would die on anymore, because I don't know for sure that it's hard to say. It's hard to leave that part of your identity, and it's not. I'm leaving it because I resent the me that was me, but I've grown. I've evolved. I've evolved into another space. And so I can still love the me who was there, who understood it that way. But then I've moved into a new way. And I'm like, I don't know that public schools, saving my traditional way of understanding public schools, make sense anymore. In retrospect, maybe it never made sense, but maybe it doesn't make sense moving forward, and maybe there's a better way to do it. Yeah. So I just don't like, so I devoted 10 years of my life and actually compromised my relationships, not intentionally, but in retrospect, with my most beloved people, doing this work for an institution that I later, upon sort of stepping out of the program, realized, what was I doing, right? Like, why was I doing that? And so now I'm just much more cautious about the good cause, bad cause thing, because it is like that Chinese farmer's parable. And the way I look at it now is like, what is good? What is bad? Something that feels really bad at the time, like my life being destabilized, could end up feeling really good when, guess what? I landed in a place that we're all safe and we can celebrate each other. And that's awesome. Will it be that way forever? Probably not. There's probably going to be some bumps down the road, and that's where it's going to go. So we have to be more flexible about it. The core of me doing education, then impact finance, then spatial web and cybernetics and blockchain Web3 tokens has taken me through to this idea of energy systems and morphic space and Albert and Arthur Whitehead's ingression and Gestalt. And at the end of the day, it feels like equal parts like quantum physics and magic. And now I'm in this community that's sitting on one of the world's largest deposits of quartz crystal next to Brazil, and we're resonating together, and we're doing these explorations of community, not based on any kind of like contractual arrangement or agreed upon or managed rules. We all just showed up and we're doing it together, and we're creating this a heart field and heart spaces, not because somebody online told us to do it. It's just we all show up and do our thing. And my thing is like clothespin fairies and heart flags, and then and other people bring kirtan, and other people bring activations about soul brilliance, and everyone's just more and more and more and more, and it's this abundance field. And I feel like what I want to remind people of is, we all adjusted our model in 2020 around a traumatic event that we built a story on what it was. And many times people continue to revisit and amplify. And what those stories did, depending on how you interpreted what happened, it created boundaries. And that boundary sometimes is dependent on an other. They're like, I'm a this because I'm not a that. Like on this boundary, I'm on this side, I'm on the good side of this boundary. And those people over there, are those institutions over there, or that vague thing I don't know that I'm afraid of is over there, and they're other. And so I'm me and that's other. And I define myself by what I am not. And I don't think it used to be that way so much, because I think we could just be like, I'll do me, you do you. But somehow this information physics of social media led us to kind of create, I think, these distorted models of just like, hey, everybody, you do your thing, right? And for the most part, if you're not plugged into all of the national politics and da 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 da, and I'm not, saying everybody should check out. If that's your thing, that's your thing. For me, my relationships are with pansies and bees and yarrow and waiting for my carriage to show up. And like, those are my beings. And yes, the world is unfolding. And the old me would have said, well, we have to do something about that. There's evil things happening. And we would pick sides and it would be a team. And then we would shout about it, mostly online, and amplify these boundaries and these heightened, creating these energy fields of subtle energy, which I've just really come to appreciate in a way that is counterproductive. It's actually a really counterproductive thing. And ultimately, I feel like the main thing we can change is ourselves. The main thing we have to come to terms with is our own innerness, and like, do that work before you start projecting out. And, I had someone I was connected to and we were going to do something. And then I realized, I'm still really triggered by the old health freedom narratives and how limiting those were. And I wish I could say I was a better person and I was like totally above all of that and I'd come to terms with it, but I haven't. But I'm still in a process. Like, I can still acknowledge that model of my frustration with people not getting impact finance and these spatial web, and even now, my frustration with people who are still reading my old stuff and being really angry and frightened, and me saying like, no, it's a participatory universe in an infinite game that's heart-centered and we have agency. Like, there are all of these stages. And I think somewhere in one of my human designs, it's like, your brain is on overdrive all the time and you could talk 24/7 and you can never tell people all the things that you feel like you wanted to tell them in your head. That's just how you came in. And so I see my limitations. Even if I had a sandbox with a bunch of people that wanted to play, until we end up with some sort of telepathic attunement, which I'm not saying couldn't happen, there's too much for me to all say it out loud and have words for it that everybody understands. So I'm just plowing ahead. So I guess that's where I'm sort of struggling with the trauma bonding of 2020, the stories we tell ourselves, how we other people. And I will say, and I think I've mentioned this before, and I don't think I was as extreme as a lot of influencers on like pointing and yelling at people and calling people the bad guy. Like, usually I was just like, hey, people, there's all this other stuff we should think about. And before we decide, like, we should understand the implications and really think about, like, do we want to turn children into oracles on surveillance play tables for Goldman Sachs to bet on? Like, maybe at some point I'm going to be the odd person out and that's totally going to be the thing everybody does. And like, we're almost to the point, like with the telepathy tapes, where I think like those sorts of things of neurodiverse people being used for information access is coming. And I was like, well, at some point it's going to be totally normal. And I'm just going to be weird that I was pushing against it. But I've jumped ahead 15 years to see where it's going. And I'm not yet comfortable with it. I'm not in a story that I'm comfortable with it. And so we can either resonate in the othering, or we can do our own work and just focus on resolving our own trauma, and which is a work in progress, and clearly I'm not done with. Chris Fields is talking about the boundary, quantum information theory and active inference, and working on a boundary and the signals that are passed, and how it's like a chalkboard. I don't know. I mentioned in that movie Good Will Hunting, where the super smart kid who's a janitor solves the fancy math problem at MIT, and it's on a chalkboard in the hallway at night and nobody knows who did it. So it's like, there's a chalkboard and we're writing notes to each other, but it's incomplete information. And our minds are unconsciously or consciously filling in the gaps with stories of what we think's happening. And often it isn't that at all. Like, when my life fell apart, I was in a particular story of what I thought it was like to be good citizen Allison being the warrior for social justice. And even though there was some little discomfort here and there, I didn't fully appreciate the depth of how destabilizing that was for people. And so, I was leaving notes on chalkboard, like going to the school board meeting and going to the rally and filming things after the Super Bowl and asking people about, educational technology. And I was doing all these things because in the story I was writing for myself, I was kind of I was dramatically othering a whole bunch of other people. And my family couldn't go along. And so their view was very different of what I was doing. And we didn't have a common language of communication. So there's this boundary that we're working with. And one of the things Chris Fields said in the interview with John Clippinger, and I have a bunch of clips online about this, and John Clippinger worked with Sandy Pentland at MIT Media Lab on the first digital identity work called ID3 or Open Mustard Seed. So it's an important interview. And in it, they're talking about the boundary, and Chris Fields says, there are different levels of engagement with the boundary. There are people who are very enmeshed with signaling on the boundary all the time. And then there are people who are intermittent with how they engage with the boundary. And so I think that's part of something we should put in not should, but you could put in your toolbox and say, how do you want to engage with your boundary, right? For me, my choice currently of engaging in my boundary is not to be part of geopolitics, but to work on connecting to plants. And that, I'm not saying that's a choice everybody should make, but that's my choice. I'm doing it consciously on how I engage with my boundary, how much information. And this boundary engagement, I think, has really, really changed with social media, especially as, it's gone to 24/7 and then shorter cycles. Like now we have the TikTok stuff that's just, and Twitter, things that were just blip, 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 blip. Like there's so much, you totally are overwhelmed, and you could step back from that boundary. So that's interesting. The other thing that he says is that, so if you imagine there's a boundary and then on either side is Hilbert space and superposition, right? Like all these potentialities, which I think is like the participatory universe and us having agency. It is in these inner places away from the boundaries that they call internal degrees of freedom where interesting computation happens. And so to me, this feels a bit like the mindfulness stuff, like the flow state stuff, and that can we pull in and be in the interior, right? In the be here now of this superposition and listen to our internal guidance, which may be connecting to these other information fields outside of what we perceive of reality, because reality is just that little slice on the boundary, and engaging at that level. And then could you do that on your own, for yourself? But then as Michael Levin talks about nested intelligences, could we get to a point that we could do that in small groups or bigger groups, right? And I think, clearly there's been so much parapsychology research and the stuff Pear at Princeton and working in the subtle energy fields. Clearly a lot of people are interested in that. How can we do that? And Chris Fields also says that quantum information theory is not geometric, but topological, like a landscape, like the Conrad Waddington's epigenetic rolling landscape with the levers that you can change underneath. And that the geometry is how the topology projects onto the surface of reality. So we've got this landscape. So we're exploring an interior landscape of our own psyche and of our collective psyche. And I think that can resonate with reality. But for people who have been traumatized, still not totally over this cold, and who are living in a place of hypervigilance, of their active inference model is bad things happen. You have to be very careful. Most things out there are looking to trick you. You don't have enough information. You could make the wrong choice and with devastating consequences. But then if I make all the right choices and I'm the good person who's in the know and I know special things that other people don't know, that enhances my ego identity. And then I have this enhanced structure to myself because I know things, like I know deep state things, or I know occulted things, or I know, special things about high technologies or these other things. And that's and I probably had some of that too when I was not intentionally, not thinking about it, but that my identity was galvanized by what I was building around this information that I had. And so how could we, if these Hilbert spaces are topological and they're resonant, how could we work together to do good? And how can we begin to resolve the hypervigilant fear part of it and get more to the play part of it? And I don't have a big answer, but part of it is, I've spoken a lot about John Wheeler and the participatory universe and James Carse and the infinite game. And I think if we can put down the being the warrior and identifying the bad guys or the potential bad guys or the potential bad narratives, which again, I'm not saying, I did this too. I did this too for quite a long time, of things I thought were bad. Put that down, and then that frees up so much open energy field to do the things that are creative and imaginal and in this liminal space and lucid dreaming, and that we could make a story that we actually like, because we can put down the stuff that we spending the energy on the stuff that we don't like, and I'm sure people who perceive me as a problem, like, said the same thing about me. It's just a tool. It's how you use it. Okay, I'm to this point. We can energetically choose where we put our attention. And if we can step away from hypervigilance around fear or being tricked, we'll have a lot of resources to do other stuff, which like make birds and things, like we would have just this whole bank of energy to work with that we didn't have before. And I think that would be pretty awesome. I can't tell people to do that, but I personally think it would be pretty cool. And I feel like people here in Hot Springs, they would be up for doing that sort of thing. And so we're doing it. We're already doing it. And okay, so I got quantum information theory, boundaries. I do think that some of that, like degrees of internal freedom and interesting computation, might relate to Michael Levin's work in polycomputing. So that's an interesting thing. And I've talked before in the past of how my thought experiment is that maybe the topological landscape that looks a lot like the Ouachita Mountains here, which are very old, looks a lot like Conrad Waddington's epigenetic landscape with the underground levers in the underworld, and that maybe the mob and the gangsters of Hot Springs, Arkansas, with their quartz crystals and all the water, are actually running quantum reality. And given that Vesta House has showed up here, like maybe I'm not wrong about that. Okay, so how do we get over hypervigilance and fear? And I'm not one of those people who really leans into the like, oh, there's two timelines and they're bifurcating and you go on one or you go on the other and whatever. Like, to me, my current lens is that it's participatory. We are powerful creative agents, and every minute you get another choice. Like, you could choose. And if you made choices in the past that ultimately, based on the information, maybe they seem like a choice based on the information you had, but now you have different information, you have more information, you would change that thing. Like, you can make that choice. You can change your circumstances every minute. Like, I don't think, think Hilbert space superposition. You can go back and you can now occupy a different story. And so if we can step into infinite game playfulness, I think that's, I would like that. And at the base, this bifurcation, I do think that there's something to what kind of worldview you hold. And I think there's one worldview that could be, there's a narrow path. There are limited ways to do it right to get to the end. There are dire consequences if you do it wrong and fall off. There's going to be people, different groups, that are going to tell you the rules of how it should be done, and we're going to be watching very carefully. And so there's not a lot of room for error, so you have to do everything perfect. I think that's a way of being that a lot of people are steeped in, from their earliest childhood in their world model. Think active inference, their world model holds that. I think there's an alternate possibility that I've come to where I'm at this point, is that I believe that we are eternal. I like this idea that we are possibly eternal patterns that are evolving and blinking and changing and dancing like the octopus with the changing the texture, but we have a boundary, and that we're exploring space in an embodied way, but that we're eternal beings, and that we come from we are an extension of Source and God, and that core place that we come from is love. And that it doesn't mean that everything that happens is going to feel loving, but that when we integrate the lessons that we're here to do as embodied beings, and I do feel like we do it more than once, we do our best. We're held, like my friend Heather Honey said, like we're safe and celebrated. We're held in that, and we integrate the hard things. Some things are sweet, some things are bittersweet, and we bring it back to Source at the time. And that's our mission, is to be embodied and do this work, and then integrate, hopefully, into wisdom, and then bring it back. But at the core is love and acceptance. within variety. And so within that love and acceptance, like, I agree, like, I'm not telling everybody to be a certain way, because I think I keep saying in my animist live action role play musical thought experiment, God loves variety. God loves variety. So, if there are people who are like, this is a bad thing, we have to do something about this bad thing and go to war against it because we're the good thing and that's the bad thing. Yeah, that's going to happen. And then there's going to be people who wander around their backyard and lie in the sun and listen to honeybees on a nice sunny day in the winter. And that's going to happen. And there's many things that are going to happen. So, like, find your place, and just what I'm trying to say is realize that you have choices, and that if you're living in a state of hypervigilance and fear of doing it the wrong thing and going off the path, or someone might trick you, then yeah, it's probably going to be that way, because where you put your attention, that's what happens. But in the next moment, you could choose love. Like, Madeline L'Engle, Wrinkle in Time, Love Wins. Like, you could be like, oh yeah, I forgot. And you can go back and forth. You can be like, I'm going to go to war against it. Oh, that's right. It all goes back to love. Okay. And that's what I really love about Richard A. Watson, who's Levin's colleague in that Kathmandu project, the Center for the Study of Apparent Selves. Like, he talks about us as eternal patterns, like songs, specifically songs, and lineages as being songs. And he's very much centered on love. And I think going back, the heart resonance, being in the right frequency with others, being part of that unified field, but differentiated. I think part of us, a lot of people with the hypervigilant fear thing, they're worried about being destroyed or being erased or being flattened or being controlled. And again, in my LARP, all the things happen. So there's going to be some of that, but I don't think any of it is permanent. Like, I don't think any of us can be permanently destroyed. And that's a big piece I'm going to be reading from, maybe some excerpts following up from the Neil Stephenson's novel Dodge or Fall, Dodge in Hell. Ultimately, he realizes that he can totally deconstruct himself and start over. And he needs to do that to be able to access his children who are like locked up in a walled garden by this other guy who's supposed to be the bad guy, but you never know who's good and who's bad, because it keeps kind of shifting, because people are complicated. And the story keeps shifting. There are nuances and different angles and different oversights. So yeah, so one of my little New Year's things was to go out and just do an appreciation in my garden. And you don't need, like, can we work from a place of playfulness? Serious play, but play. Can we work from a sense of wonder? And can we find that with regularity in the face of, it's a balm for the trauma. And, I have my little yard. I kind of like messed up my arm a little bit this by overdoing it digging. So everybody send me some good juju that, like, winter rest will resolve that. And I will be back to digging and hauling in the spring. But every day for the last week, I've been going out and just writing 3 or 4 things that kind of speak to me that day, that are sweet and beautiful. And I did say when I decided to come here and leave Philadelphia that I was going to go and make my corner of the world beautiful. And so I have this little corner and I'm making it beautiful with the garden. Like, we're doing a complexity emergence thing, and it's awesome. And so I'll just read you a few, because Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about this a lot in Breeding Sweetgrass and some of her other books. But it doesn't have to be, like, you don't have to go to Glacier National Park and, like, look at a giant mountain and a mountain goat to have that level of awe. Like, it can be a pansy. It's all in the story that you tell. So these are some of the things this week. This brilliant green of my garlic coming up. The scent of mountain mint that I planted and using it in some tea. Picking leeks that are still left over and putting them in chicken dumpling soup. Listening to the red-headed woodpecker and the maple tree next door, and appreciating all the mistletoe that's expanding into the maple canopy. The fragrance, the oily thickness of the rosemary in my herb bed. My first peony starting to peek up in the backyard. These just really super cheerful purple and white pansy faces. They look like a little choir next to my laundry line. Today was turtle doves murmuring, like when you walk up and there's maybe 6 or 8 and they go woo, 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 woo. There were two honeybees on my Yuletide camellia, which is unusual because I don't actually have a lot of honeybees in the season in my garden. They're usually a lot more native bees. So there were these two honeybees cruising my Yuletide camellia, which is, besides the pansies, the only flowers that are available. And that was happy. I have incredible yarrow, some common yarrow and then some rose yarrow. And I've been collecting yarrow stalks for divining for the I Ching. They're super green and fresh and frondy. They look great this time of year. And then I just lay on my back. I have this lawn. I don't know what kind of grass. I lived in the city for all those years, so I didn't have grass except for going to parks. And so this is it's springy, and it goes all yellow in the winter, but it's springy and bouncy, a little prickly. You can lay down, and today it's been really warm. And a lot of times here, when it's warm, it's overcast. But today it's clear. It was like New Year's Day was the same. It was like in the mid 60s and clear and sunny. And I just lay on the grass. And I'm always a little bit worried that my neighbors, who are very kind, will look out at me and think that I had a heart attack or I'm dead in the yard, which is kind of funny. So I'm just laying in the grass with my eyes closed, listening to the birds and listening to the mockingbird sing and sing and sing and all the different songs, and thinking about that phrase about that bird song helps the grass grow, and thinking about the honeybees and their frequencies and just how exciting life is if we can get past the materialism and think about it on an energetic resonance level, or at least complementary. Not the body stuff is good too, but it's limited. It's not all there is. There's all this other stuff. Yeah, so hopefully you guys can. Hopefully this helps. I'm going to read my purpose from my Gene Key profile. So you'll say why is she babbling on and on about this? I don't know. Someone says you're just so narcissistic, and that's not it. I don't know. There's something I'm supposed to do. I haven't figured it out yet. But so this is the thing. It says you are here in the world with one purpose: to question everything and still remain entirely open. And there's this quote, it's translated from Rumi, and I guess some people say oh, maybe that's not actually an accurate translation, but it has to do with out in the field beyond right doing and wrong doing. I'll meet you there. And I sort of feel wow, the field, right, is this sunny field, and where even being separate doesn't make sense anymore, that we're all together. And I feel like that feels like a message that has a lot of relevance for me this year. Is that this idea that within these certain boundaries, they're very dynamic, and that we can maintain our own sovereignty and our own patterningness, but then we could also merge in interesting ways with other people's patterns that we resonate with. And then in doing that, create these topological landscapes of reality that are sometimes somehow immensely creative and artistic and heartfelt. I think that that's possible. And I don't have a good language to talk about it because it's somewhere between... I have a whole bunch of books about Henri Corbin that I want to spend some more time with this winter on the imaginal world, right? The imaginal, how do we work with the imaginal, and in a way that's awesome and exciting and beautiful. So anyway, so I am in the world with one purpose: to question everything and remain entirely open. So out in that field beyond right doing and wrong doing. Your whole life is an inquiry into life. You may learn an enormous amount while you are alive, but none of this knowledge is the reason you are here. You're here to inspire others to remain as open as you are. Wherever you see dogma or opinion, your role is to expose it as one-sided and therefore incomplete. And I will say that not because I came in knowing all of this, but I learned it myself. I made presumptions and I told stories about things that I later realized were incomplete and wrong. And if I had held that story close and not let it go, it would have harmed me. And that actually related to stories I was telling myself when I came to Hot Springs and people I met. And by being able to step beyond that, I've grown so much, and I've had these beautiful, beautiful opportunities that have opened to me in my life, and I've learned a lot of lessons. So I'm not saying this I'm trying to break down dogma because I'm better and I know. I'm saying there are these opportunities that if you can let things go and not be so rigid, you might be surprised at how wonderful it could be. You are not here to necessarily offer people solutions, but expose doubts and fears that lie inside them so they can find their own way. At times, you may wonder deeply about whether your life is truly of value, and the answer is always yes. Just because you can see both sides of everything does not mean you cannot have opinions. On the contrary, it allows you to have truly informed opinions. It is out of your open-mindedness that you will discover your greatest gift, how to tread much more lightly through life than those around you. It is for this lightness more than anything else that you might learn or achieve in life that you will be most remembered. And if I ever get to that spot, which I'm not saying I will, I'll have my kid to thank for it, because they kind of walked out of my life to tell me I had to be a different person. And that was like having one of the things that you most care about in your life removed. That's like the highest stakes thing there is. And it's taken a lot of processing to come to that. And I do have this radical acceptance. My sense is us being apart is probably not easy on either of us. And to have that sacrifice be made in that distance for me to grow into the person that I am supposed to be, to realize my potential. I mean, it's not easy for any involved. And I'm grateful to be making progress, hopefully. Not there yet, but and maybe in my making progress and doing it publicly, you guys will find it helpful. So I'm going to take a break now because I have to go run my errand, but I am going to come back and close this out by reading a section from Cryptonomicon, because Neal Stephenson is the person who, if I squint and look sideways, his books tell me a lot about the unfolding patterns. And then I think also, I'm not going to start this today, but there is a book called Babel 17 by Samuel Delany, and it's super interesting. It's a sci-fi book from 1966, and it features, it's like a space mission, where the commander is a spectrumy autistic Chinese female poet, and all of these very interesting characters that come together as her team. And so I think there's something about teaming and flow and interdimensionality, and the thing that they have to address is this language that somehow hijacks. It's like a Namshub mind virus. And so there's a lot in there about the Worf-Sapir hypothesis, about how language shapes our outlook. And then one of the characters that's quote unquote like a villain or a bad guy, it turns out he's not, shocker. Part of his process is that his language has no frame of reference for I as an individual unit. And so I think that's really interesting if we're talking about active inference and quantum information theory and othering and boundaries and interpenetration and the Flower Garland Sutra and God and Source, is like, what does this dance look like between letting go of the I as I understand the I that lives on the film strip and stepping into the quantum superposition I? And how can the quantum superposition I relate to your quantum position self? And like, how do we all work together at like a level of frequency that I don't think, well, I'm not a math person, so I certainly don't have language for it. I think somehow there's some aspect of that that's going to happen through creativity and artistry and visual arts, dance, music, narrative, poetry. It's going to happen that way. And it's interesting because Samuel Delany, he was, I think, part of the Harlem Renaissance. His family was part of the Harlem Renaissance, and he was gay or bisexual. Eventually, I think he taught at Temple University in Philadelphia. But back in the day, he ran in the same circles as my ex's uncle, John Herbert McDowell, who was a composer for a lot of avant-garde music in New York. So anyway, that was kind of super interesting to think about. So I think I'm going to do a read aloud of Babel 17, even though it's kind of quirky and weird, and because I think it matters in terms of figuring out our quantum entangled boundaries. So thanks for listening. when I come back, I'll read the Cryptonomicon thing and we'll close it out. Aaron done. And I apologize if this feels a little rambly. I still am a little bit spacey brain, head cold. But I did really think that this idea about managing boundaries in internal degrees of freedom and telling creative stories and trying to address past trauma stories and how we do it individually and collectively was important. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'm going to close out now with a section from Cryptonomicon. And if you listen to my talks, you'll probably know I read a lot of Neal Stephenson. For him, for me, he is one of the people that really, he has a lot of books that are like door stoppers, right? And there's a lot of insights in his books. And I always find it so interesting that people who comment on Reddits and various critiques or fan things, it's always at sort of a superficial story level, and it doesn't really touch on any of these deeper elements of emergence and complexity that I'm interested in. I find that interesting. And in one of the interviews, because Neal Stephenson is connected to Kevin Kelly of Wired Magazine and Art and Ritual at Burning Man and the Long Now Foundation, and that clock that they're building in West Texas is based on Neal Stephenson's idea in his novel Anathem about sort of mystical, math-oriented philosophers and multiverses. And so anyway, and when I'm spending time, I'm mostly listening now to Fall, Dodge, and Hell. And it just got me thinking about the connection between Neal Stephenson and Kevin Kelly, and if Kevin Kelly had connections to the Santa Fe Institute, because that's really where, in the mid-'80s, all of this emergent complexity came out of, that level of research. And it was a lot of folks from Los Alamos, but there were connections to the Aspen Institute. And as it turned out, Kevin Kelly was sort of in the mix in those early years, and his interest in complexity and all of the Santa Fe Institute stuff with complexity really overlapped a lot with computational social systems and economics. And so it wasn't just like the bankers were funding the Santa Fe Institute, but that really what they were up to with patterns and complexity was current-based signals, of which at a scaled social societal level, that looks like economics. But maybe what economics actually looks like is a topological landscape of attractor fields, which is what like the Kevin Iwaki and the token engineering people are on and on about. So anyway, so Kevin Kelly was connected to Santa Fe Institute. And when I found an interview with him when he was talking about it, and in that interview, it's really interesting because he also said that for 11 years, he worked on a graphic novel, like a 500-page graphic novel with people from Pixar called The Silver Cord, about essentially embodiment, the importance of human embodiment in this place, and that there were these angels, which you could also imagine as angles mathematically, angels sort of looking down and thinking that the humans were really underutilizing their embodiment affordances and bummed that they couldn't also be embodied, and that there's this workaround and some rogue angels / angles went down and jumped into robot bodies. And so given all the stuff with emergent, telepresence, robotic labor and robots, it makes me think about the story of the angels. And I've thought to myself for a while, in this age of Aquarius, which is the water bearer, which is sort of interdimensional boundary crossings, is that like maybe God wants to have a more interesting conversation with us, like step up and have a more sophisticated conversation, but that interdimensional high-level beingness needs a place to sit down here in 3D space-time, and then maybe a place to sit might look like a robot. So anyway, that's sort of an intersection between Neal Stephenson and Kevin Kelly. And so I just got out of my car after running my errand, and I was just gazing at my herb bed and thinking about the bulbs that are coming up, and mostly at this point it's the windflower, the Greek windflower, the anemones, and the alliums, and a few, the peony came up a little bit, not really many daffodils yet, but thinking about things that are underground, the undergroundness of it, and how that really is a basis for a lot of these decentralized networking systems, is the hyphae and the fungal networks and the root systems and the mycorrhizal fungi working with the roots and the Wood Wide Web, and that a lot of that is quote unquote hidden, right, or occulted. It's below where our visual senses, which by themselves are already very limited, are missing. And I feel like surfacing some of that might overlap with, the work that Leo is doing around crop insurance and parametric insurance and climate modeling, which is really all about chaos theory. Weather and climate is a lot of the Dodge or Fall, Dodge, and Hell has to do with chaos theory, and that guy Ralph Abraham's work, Gaia Eros. Chaos Gaia Eros is clearly, love and chaos. So just thinking about like the root networks, and this character that I'm going to finish out with from Cryptonomicon, Stevenson makes these really complex worlds that have lineages, and again, they're all very thick books. And the prequel to Cryptonomicon is a series of books called the Baroque Cycle. And I really love the Baroque Cycle because it's historical fiction. So sort of equal parts of the characters are based on actual historical figures, and then there's fictional characters. But in their interactions, you learn a lot about natural philosophers and the Royal Society and in the early rise of Enlightenment and scientism and all of that, but that it was also connected to alchemy and Newton. So I've learned a lot about real people through reading the Baroque Cycle. And so through this and actually into the Dodo book, which is about the loss of magic due to photography, there's a character and his name is Enoch Root. And he's an immortal character across all of the books, and he keeps surfacing and knitting the storylines together, the story arcs together. And you could think of a root as like a mathematical root, like the root, but then also the roots of these plants, that they're doing all of this energy exchanging, but it's below the surface where our limited senses can't quite perceive it. And so I think the idea of rootedness and these lineages and the networks really does relate to Richard A. Watson's work in the Songs of Life and Mind, that he's positing about songs and lineages, and that the networks could also be compositions, right? Thinking about topology both as a landscape and as a work of art and something that has its own vibrational frequency. So to close, this is a section from Cryptonomicon that this novel has two storylines. One is based in World War II cryptography and Japanese gold, and then the modern one is based in data centers, tokenized Web3 data centers. Now this is set in like 2000, so it's already quite dated, in the Philippines. And then they intersect, the storylines intersect. So in this one that I'm going to read from, it's the 20th century storyline, and one of the people who's working on this data center gets framed to have drugs in his luggage, and then he gets thrown in this Philippine jail, and they're trying to get a key for some encryption. And I do think that this key, the puzzle for finding keys is really important. So, and next to him, he can't quite see him, but he can hear that there's another occupant, and that occupant is Enoch Root. And so they're having this exchange that speaks to the idea of archetype and patterns and immortality. And he also sets apart a comparison between Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Ares, the god of war. And that Athena is more aligned with hackers in terms of the sophistication of her engagement in the game, and that Ares is sort of a thug and just like does violent things. And so I think when we imagine how we work with our boundaries and how we imagine the archetypes of good and bad, and how good and bad shift depending on what our model of reality is and where we are in relation to it, and how our own internal story arc changes over time, that being like, like my Gene Key thing says, open, right? And not fixed and orthodox and firm, because once you're fixed, your view gets very narrow because you have to defend a certain story. The certain story you're defending is narrow. Anything that falls outside, you disregard. And then you have to go to combat with the people who are trying to throw you off your story. And in that energetic engagement, there's all of this stuff around you that you're never going to be able to explore, because your task is simply to defend this bit of land right here that you've chosen. But the thing to remember is you chose it, and you could unchoose it and do something differently if you want. And for me, what I've learned is you can choose differently, and you can still love and have compassion for the you who made that choice, and then you can make a new choice. And so we're these dynamic evolving pattern systems. Okay, so Enoch Root is telling his backstory in the jail cell to Randy. It all seems like a plausible enough cover story to Randy, but I'm guessing that a lot of people in the government are appalled by the fact that they've thrown a saint into jail, he says, and so they have moved you here to the high prestige luxury jail with private cells. Once again, your understanding of the local culture is conspicuous, Enoch Root said. He shifts his position on the bed, and his crucifix swings back and forth ponderously. He also has a medallion around his neck with something startling written on it. Do you have some occult symbol there? Randy asks, squinting. I beg your pardon? I can make out the word occult on your medallion there. It says ignoti et quasi occulti, which means unknown and partially hidden, or words to that effect, says Enoch Root. And I would say that's the quantum boundaries, is that we have this boundary and things are partly hidden. Like we'll never know the whole entirety of the story. We'll never be able to see something from someone else, another system's perspective. We can only make our best guess, and that best guess is the active inference. Okay. It is the motto of a society to which I belong. You must know that the word occult does not intrinsically have anything to do with satanic rituals and drinking blood and all of that. I was trained as an astronomer, Randy says, so I learned all about occultation, the concealment of one body behind another as during an eclipse. Oh, well then, I'll shut up. In fact, I know more than you might think about occultation, Randy says. It might seem like he's beating a dead horse, except that catches the eye of Enoch Root while he's saying it and gives a significant sidelong glance at his computer. And Root processes this for a moment and then nods. Who's the lady in the middle, the Virgin Mary, Randy asks. Root fingers the medallion without looking at it and says, reasonable guess, but wrong. It's Athena. The Greek goddess? Yes. How do you square that with Christianity? Well, when I phoned you the other day, how did you know it was me? I don't know. I just recognized you. Recognize me? Well, what does that mean? You didn't recognize my voice. Is this some roundabout way of answering my question about Athena worship versus Christianity? Doesn't it strike you as remarkable that you can look at a stream of characters on a screen of your computer, email from someone you've never seen, and later, quote, recognize the same person on the phone? How does that work, Randy? I haven't the faintest idea. The brain can do some weird... Some complain that email is impersonal, that your contact with me during the email phase of our relationship was mediated by wires and screens and cables. Some would say that's not as good as conversing face-to-face, and yet our seeing of things is always mediated by corneas, retinas, optic nerves, and some neural machinery that takes the information from the optic nerve and propagates it onto our minds. So, is looking at words on a screen so much inferior? I think not. At least then you are conscious of the distortions. Whereas when you see someone with your eyes, you forget about the distortions and imagine you are experiencing them purely and immediately. So what's your explanation of how I recognized you? Well, I would argue that inside your mind was some pattern of neurological activity that was not there before you exchanged an email with me. The root representation. It is not me. I'm this big slug of carbon and oxygen and some other stuff on this cot right next to you, me. The root rep, by contrast, is the thing that you'll carry around in your brain for the rest of your life, barring some kind of major neurological insult that your mind uses to represent me. When you think about me, in other words, you're not thinking about me qua this big slug of carbon. You are thinking about the root rep. Indeed, someday you might get released from jail and run into someone who would say, you know, I was in the Philippines once running around in the boondocks and I ran into this old fart who started talking to me about root reps. And then by exchanging notes, as it were, with this fellow, you would be able to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that the root rep in your brain and the root rep in his brain were generated by the same actual slug of carbon and oxygen and so on. Me. And it's interesting here to me that he's really emphasizing the slug of carbon because I'm getting this feeling that the UN SDGs and the carbon trading, which are connected to Winrock International, Winthrop Rockefeller's legacy estate, and Gestalt and Christiana Figueres and the Quakers is all about patterning, right? And so the Gestalt of the pattern of the two individuals is embodied in the slug of carbon on the boundary. But that's not the core of it. There's the root behind in superposition. And this has something to do with Athena. Well, if you think of Greek gods as real supernatural beings who lived on Mount Olympus, no. But if you think of them as being in the same class of entities as the root rep, which is to say patterns of neurological activity that the mind uses to represent things that it sees or thinks that it sees in the outside world, then yes. Suddenly, Greek gods can be just as interesting and relevant as real people. Why? Well, because in the same way as you might one day encounter another person with his own root rep, so if you were to have a conversation with an ancient Greek person and he started talking about Zeus, you might, once you got over your initial feelings of superiority, discover that you had some mental representations inside of your own mind that, though you didn't name them Zeus and didn't think of them as a big hairy thunderbolt hurling son of a Titan, nonetheless had been generated as the result of interactions with entities in the outside world that are the same ones that caused the Zeus representation to appear in the Greek's mind. And here we could talk about Plato's cave thing for a while, the vegomatic of metaphors. It slices, it dices. In which, Randy says, the actual entities in the real world are three-dimensional real things that are casting the shadows. This Greek dude and I are the wretches chained up looking at the shadows of those things on the walls, and it's just the shape of the wall in front of me is so different from the shape of the wall in front of the Grecian. So that given a shadow projected on your wall, it's going to adopt a different shape from the shadow projected on his wall, where different wall shapes here correspond to, let's say, your modern scientific worldview versus his ancient pagan worldview. And that's back to the archetypes and projective geometry. Yeah, that Plato's cave metaphor. At this very moment, some wag of a prison guard out in the corridor throws a switch and shuts off all the lights. The only illumination now is from the screensaver on Randy's laptop, which is running animations of colliding galaxies. It's interesting that in the story, he was an astronomer. Patterns, star patterns. I think we can stipulate that the wall in front of you, Randy, is a considerably flatter and smoother. In other words, generally it gives you a much more accurate shadow than his wall. And yet it is clear that he is still capable of seeing the same shadows and probably drawing some useful conclusions about the shapes of the things that cast them. And so I feel like it's interesting to think about the boundary layer from Chris Fields with the quantum information theory. I mean, could that be a kind of wall with a projection on it, and how we're interpreting the projections based on what we expect to see, which is the active inference, free energy principle models? That's kind of interesting. And the light, where is the light? You know, because I am still very interested in like the photonics and the idea of the Quakers and the light within. And even Iris, the goddess who goes back and forth between the reality and the gods, is the rainbow and the colors. So it all feels like projection. I have to look up, there was a book I read a while ago about projectors. The difference engine, I think. I need to go back and look at the difference engine with this lens. Okay, so back to the book. So the illumination of this colliding galaxy screensaver. Okay, so the Athena that you honor on your medallion isn't a supernatural being who lives on a mountain in Greece, etc., but rather whatever entity, pattern, trend, or what have you, that when perceived by ancient Greek people and filtered through their perceptual machinery and their pagan worldview, produced the internal mental representation that they dubbed Athena. The distinction being quite important because Athena, the supernatural chick with the helmet, is of course non-existent, but, quote, Athena, the eternal generator of the internal representation dubbed Athena by the ancient Greeks, must have existed back then, or else the internal representation never would have been generated. And if she existed back then, the chances are excellent that she exists now. And if all that is the case, then whatever ideas the ancient Greeks, who though utter shitheads in many ways were terrifyingly intelligent people, had about her are probably still quite valid. Okay, but why Athena and not Demeter or someone? Well, I mean, it's a truism that you can't understand a person without knowing something about their family background. So we have to do sort of a Cliff Notes number on the ancient Greek theogony here. We start off with chaos, which is where all theogonies start, and which I like to think of as a sea of white noise, totally random broadband static. And for reasons that we don't really understand, certain polarities begin to coalesce for this. Day, night, darkness, light, earth, sea. Personally, I like to think of these as crystals, not in the hippy-dippy California sense, but in the hard-ass technical sense of resonators that received certain channels buried in the static of chaos. Here I am in Crystal Land. That's West Mountain, opening to the underworld right behind me. The resonators. And out down the road from Hot Springs is Mount Ida, which is another center for a lot of quartz crystals, where the Avant mining people, who are Alice Walton's crystal mining people, have their mines out that way. And Mount Ida is where Zeus was taken to be raised after Rhea gave Kronos the rock. So isn't that interesting? It's just also fascinating. And again, I live a quarter mile off of Albert Pike Road. So crystals and resonators. Okay, at some point, out of a certain incestuous couplings among such entities, you get titans. And it is arguably kind of interesting to note that the titans provide really the full complement of basic gods. I mean, you've got the sun god, Hyperion, an ocean god, Oceanus, and so on. But they all get overthrown in a power struggle called the Titanomachia and replaced with new gods like Apollo and Poseidon, who end up filling the same slots in the organizational chart, as it were. Which is kind of interesting in that it seems to tie in with what I was saying about the entities or patterns persisting through time, but casting slightly different shaped shadows for different people. Anyway, so now we have the gods of Olympus as we normally think of them, Zeus, Hera, and so on. A couple of basic observations about these. First, they all, with one exception I'll get to soon, were produced by some sort of sexual coupling, either Titan-Titaness, or God-Goddess, or God-Nymph, or God-Woman, or basically Zeus and whoever or whatever Zeus was fucking on any particular day. Which brings me to a second basic observation, which is that the gods of Olympus are the most squalid and dysfunctional family imaginable. And yet there is something about the motley asymmetry of this pantheon that makes it more credible. Like the periodic table of the elements or the family tree of the elementary particles or just about any anatomical structure you might pull out of a cadaver, it has enough of a pattern to give our minds something to work on, and yet an irregularity that indicates some kind of organic provenance. And you have a sun god and a moon goddess, for example, which is all clean and symmetrical. And yet over here is Hera, who has no role whatsoever except to be a literal bitch goddess. And then there's Dionysus, who isn't even fully a god, he's half human, but he gets to be in the pantheon anyway and sit on Olympus with the gods, as if you went to the Supreme Court and found Bozo the clown planted among the justices. And now what I'm getting to here is that Athena was exceptional in any kind of normal sense. She sprang fully formed from the head of Zeus. According to some versions of the story, this happened after Zeus fucked Metis, about whom we'll hear more in due course. And then he was warned that Metis would later give birth to a son who would dethrone him, and so he ate her. And later Athena came out of his head. Now, whether you buy into the meta story or not, I think that we can still agree that something a little peculiar was going on with the nativity of Athena. She was also exceptional in that she did not participate in the moral squalor of Olympus. She was a virgin. Aha! I knew that was a picture of a virgin on your medallion. Yes, Randy, you do have a keen eye for virgins. Hephaestus' leg fucked her once, but he did not achieve penetration. She is quite important in the Odyssey, and there's really very few myths in the usual sense of that term that involve her. The one exception proves the rule, the story of Arachne. Arachne was a superb weaver who became arrogant and began taking credit herself instead of attributing her talent to the gods. Arachne went so far as to issue an open challenge to Athena, who is the goddess of weaving, among other things. Now think entanglement, right? That's part of the quantum information theory. Now keep in mind that the typical Greek myth goes something like this. Innocent shepherd boy is minding his own business, an overflying god spies him and gets a hard-on, swoops down and rapes him silly. While the victim is staggering around in a daze, the god's wife or lover, in a jealous rage, turns him into the helpless innocent victim, that is, into, let's say, an immortal turtle, and the power staples him to a sheet of plywood with a dish of turtle food just out of reach and leaves him out in the sun forever to be repeatedly disemboweled by army ants and stung by hornets or something. So if Arachne had just dissed anyone else in the pantheon, she would have just been a smoking hole in the ground before she knew what hit her. But in this case, Athena appeared to her in the guise of an old woman and recommended that she display proper humility. Arachne declined her advice, and then finally Athena revealed herself as such and challenged Arachne to a weaving contest, which you'll have to admit was uncommonly fair-minded of her. And the interesting thing is that the contest turned out to be a draw. Arachne was just really good as Athena. The only problem was that her weaving depicted the gods of Olympus at their shepherd-raping interspecies fucking worst. And this weaving was simply a literal and accurate illustration of all those other myths that make this into a sort of meta-myth. And Athena flew off the handle and whacked Arachne with her distaff, which might seem like kind of a poor anger management system until you consider that during the struggle against the giants, she wasted Enceladus by dropping Sicily on him. The only effect was to cause Arachne to recognize her own hubris, at which she became so ashamed that she hanged herself. Athena then brought her back to life in the form of a spider. So, anyway, you probably learned in elementary school that Athena wears a helmet, carries a shield called Aegis, and is the goddess of war and wisdom, as well as crafts, such as the aforementioned weaving. Kind of an odd combination, to say the least, especially since Ares was supposed to be the god of war, and Hestia, the goddess of home economics. Why the redundancy? Hestia is Vesta, right? But a lot's been screwed up in translation. See, the kind of wisdom that we associate with old farts like yours truly, and which I'm trying to impart to you here, Randy Waterhouse, was called Dike by the Greeks. That's not what Athena was the goddess of. She was the goddess of Metis, which means cunning or craftiness, and which you'll recall was the name of her mother in one version of the story. Interestingly, Metis, the personage, not the attribute, provided young Zeus with the potion that caused Cronus to vomit up all of the baby gods he had swallowed, setting the stage for the whole Titanomachia. So now the connection to craft becomes obvious. Crafts are just the practical application of Metis. I associate the word crafts with making crappy belts and ashtrays in summer camp, Randy says. I mean, who wants to be the fucking fucking goddess of macrame? We did this at the portal when I did my salon. We had entanglement, and we did macrame. We did entangling magic and esoteric economics. It's all bad translation. The word that we use today to mean the same thing is really technology. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Instead of calling Athena the goddess of war and wisdom and macrame, then we should say war and technology. And here again, we have the problem of an overlap with the jurisdiction of Ares, who's supposed to be the god of war. And let's just say Ares is a complete asshole. His personal aids are fear and terror and sometimes strife. He is constantly at odds with Athena, and even though, and maybe because, they are nominally the god and goddess of the same thing, war, Heracles, who is one of Athena's human proteges, physically wounds Ares on 2 occasions and even strips him of his weapons at one point. You'll see the fascinating thing about Ares is that he is completely incompetent. He's chained up by a couple of giants and imprisoned in a bronze vessel for 13 months. He's wounded by one of Odysseus' drinking buddies during the Iliad. Athena knocks him out with a rock at one point. When he's not making a complete idiot of himself in battle, he's screwing every human female he can get his hands on. And get this, his sons are all what we would call today serial killers. And so it seems very clear to me that Ares really was a god of war. As such an entity would be recognized by people who were involved in wars all the time and had a really clear idea of just how stupid and ugly wars are. Whereas Athena is famous for being the backer of Odysseus, who, let's not forget, is the guy who comes up with the idea for the Trojan horse. Athena guides both Odysseus and Heracles through their struggles, and although both of these guys are excellent fighters, they win most of their battles through cunning, or less pejoratively, metis. And although both of them engage in violence pretty freely, Odysseus likes to call himself sacker of cities, it is clear that they are being held up in opposition to the kind of mindless raging violence associated with Ares and his offspring. Heracles even personally rids the world of a few of Ares' psychopathic sons. I mean, the records aren't totally clear. It's not like you can go to Thebes County Courthouse and look up the death certificates of these guys. But it appears that Heracles, backed up by Athena all the way, personally murders at least half of Hannibal Lecterish offspring of Ares. So, insofar as Athena is a goddess of war, what really do we mean by that? Note that her most famous weapon is not her sword, but her shield, Aegis, and Aegis has a Gorgon's head on it, so that anyone who attacks her is in serious danger of being turned to stone. She's always being described as being calm and majestic, neither of which adjectives anyone ever applies to Ares. I don't know, Enoch. Defensive versus offensive war, maybe? The distinction is overrated. Remember when I said that Athena got leg-fucked by Hephaestus? It generated a clear internal representation in his mind. As a myth should. Athena/Hephaestus is sort of an interesting coupling in that there's another technology god, metals, metallurgy, and fire. Those were his specialties. The old-fashioned Rust Belt stuff. And so no wonder Athena gave him a hard-on, and he ejaculated on Athena's thigh, and she's all like, ugh, and wipes it off and throws the rag on the ground, where it somehow combines with the earth and generates Erichthonius. You know who Erichthonius was? No. One of the first kings of Athens. And do you know what he was famous for? Tell me. Invented the chariot and introduced the use of silver as currency. Oh, Jesus. Randy claps his head between his hands and makes moaning noises only for a little while. Now, in many other mythologies, you can find gods that have parallels with Athena. The Sumerians have Enki. The Norse have Loki. Loki was an inventor god, but psychologically had more in common with Ares. He was not only the god of technology, but the god of evil, too. The closest thing they had to the devil. Native Americans had tricksters, creatures full of cunning, like coyote and raven in their mythologies. But they didn't have technology yet, and so they hadn't coupled the trickster with crafts to generate this hybrid technologist god. Okay, Randy said, so obviously where you're going with this is that there must be some universal pattern of events that when filtered through the sensory apparatus and the neural rigs of primitive, superstitious people always gives rise to internal mental representations that they identify as gods, heroes, etc. And again, you think archetypes and free energy principle and active inference, right? Telling stories about the world based on our senses and the patterns that we encounter. Yes, and these can be recognized across cultures in the same way that two persons with root reps in their mind might recognize me by comparing notes. So, Enoch, you want me to believe that these gods, which aren't really gods, but it's a nice concise word, all share certain things in common, precisely because the external reality that generated them is consistent and universal across cultures. That's right. And in the case of trickster gods, the pattern is that cunning people tend to attain power that uncunning people don't, and that all cultures are fascinated by this. Some of them, like many Native Americans, basically admire it, but never couple it with technological development. Others, like the Norse, hate it and identify it with the devil. Hence, the strange love-hate relationship that Americans have with hackers. That's right. Hackers are always complaining that journalists call them bad guys, but you could think that this ambivalence is deeper seated. In some cultures, the Vikings, to judge from their mythology, would instinctively hate hackers, but something different happened with the Greeks. The Greeks liked their geeks. That is how we get Athena. Well, I'll buy that, but where does the war goddess thing come in? Let's face it, Randy, we've all known guys like Ares, the pattern of human behavior that caused the internal mental representation known as Ares to appear in the minds of the ancient Greeks is very much with us today in the form of terrorists, serial killers, riots, pogroms, and aggressive tin-horn dictators who turn out to be military incompetents. And yet, for all their stupidity and incompetence, people like that can conquer and control large chunks of the world if they are not resisted. You must meet my friend Avi. Who is going to fight them off, Randy? I'm afraid you're going to say we are. Sometimes it might be other Ares worshippers, as when Iran and Iraq went to war and no one cared who won. But if Ares worshippers aren't going to end up running the whole world, someone needs to do violence to them. This isn't very nice, but it is a fact. Civilization requires an aegis, and the only way to fight the bastards off in the end is through intelligence, cunning, metis. Tactical cunning like Odysseus and the Trojan horse, or both that and technological cunning. From time to time, there is a battle that is an out-and-out won by a new technology, like longbows at Cressy. For most of history, those battles happen only every few centuries. You have the chariot, the compound bow, gunpowder, ironclad ships, and so on. But something happens around, say, the time of the Monitor, which the Northerners believe to be the only ironclad warship on Earth, that just happens to run into the Merrimack, of which the Southerners believe exactly the same thing. And they pound the hell out of each other for hours and hours. And that's as good a point as any to identify the moment when a spectacular rise in military technology faces off. It is the elbow in the exponential curve. Now it takes the world essentially conservative military establishments a few decades to really comprehend what happened. And by that time, we're thick in the Second World War. And it's accepted by everyone who doesn't have his head completely up his ass that war is going to be won by whoever has the best technology. So on the German side alone, we've got rockets, jet aircraft, nerve gas, wire-guided missiles. And on the Allied side, we've got 3 vast efforts that put basically every top-level hacker, nerd, and geek to work. The code-breaking thing, which, as you know, gave rise to the digital computer. The Manhattan Project, which gave us nuclear weapons. And the Radiation Lab, which gave us the modern electronics industry. Funded by Alfred Loomis of Loomis Labs and Brainwaves and Death, which is all about the patterns. Do you know why we won the Second World War, Randy? I think you just told me. Because we built better stuff than the Germans? Isn't that what you said? But why did we build better stuff, Randy? I guess I'm not competent to answer, Enoch. I haven't studied that period well enough. Well, the short answer is that we won because the Germans worshipped Ares and we worshipped Athena. And am I supposed to gather that you or your organization had something to do with that? Oh, come on now, Randy. Let us not degenerate this into conspiracy theory. Sorry, I'm tired. So am I. Good night. And then Enoch goes to sleep just like that. And Randy doesn't. To the Cryptonomicon. So, of course, at the end there, they do fall into the good guy, bad guy trope. We're just going to pretend that the Nazis didn't get all of their eugenic stuff from Long Island and Cold Spring Harbor Labs funded by the Carnegies. But a story for another day. So, I guess that just closes it up. Again, we have this Vesta House thing here in Hot Springs. I know it's all about archetypes. And Vesta is the goddess of the hearth. And she's the virgin goddess keeping Zeus and Hera's hearth, which is the polarity and the creative force. And I'm not sure if I read somewhere that a cauldron is part of the hearth. I know Caerdwyn, the Celtic goddess, is the goddess of sort of the potential, the holding of the hearth. But it's interesting for me, the things that I love. I still like handmade things, and I do fiber stuff, but I like pottery and wooden bowls, and I just in trying to kind of get cozy in my house, I went and there's a local potter that they've been here since the 70s, Fox Pass Pottery, and the second generation son, and so I bought a nice big bowl, and I ordered a little wooden bowl to go with it. So there's something about containers, like the holding, the open holding, because I think that the universe is open. Drew Hempel, he talks about like non-commutativity and asymmetry and the spiral, like that the spiral is an open spiral. There's constancy across the circuits of the spiral, but it's open. It isn't closed. And when we're operating from a place of fear that everything is going to be wrong all the time, the world gets very small. And it has to be very small for us to control all the things. And for many, many years, I was a planner. My master's was in historic preservation planning and policy planning, and I always had the plan. And like as the mom, you're the person with the plan and the list and the this day we're going here and there, and a few years we need to get to this point or whatever. I always had a plan. My mom used to joke, my maiden name is Hover, that Hovers, we go bitterly about the task at hand. Like we have the plan and we do the thing. And this whole part of my life now is really getting outside the plan, right? Like leaving the quantum potential open and then trying to resonate it, which is, something I'm really learning from my friend Star. And Star had a career in nuclear medicine in Santa Barbara and now does flower essences. And if I had, knowing all I know about Ojai and Santa Barbara and Montecito and all of the things, all the stories I've told myself, what a failure, what a sad thing it would have been for me to, out of fear of that this was possibly something that was going to be not right, that I never made myself available to a connection that's taught me a lot and given me a chance, and that we appreciate each other, that we complement each other, and then it's been this learning thing. So I just want to offer that to people because I short-circuited myself a lot. And I thought I knew all the things. I thought I had it dialed in. Like I thought I knew about schools. I thought I knew. And then at some point things can tip and you get at another level and you're like, oh, wow, I see that. I have another perspective on that, which doesn't mean that the first perspective was totally invalid. It's just, wow, there's this other whole vantage point. And if you situate that vantage point in the next story out, it looks even more different and has larger consequences. And so for me in my toolbox, the participatory universe, the curious observer, and the infinite game, and the idea of bracketing an immersion, of doing serious play and then stepping out and going in and stepping out, it's opened up so much space for me to explore in a way that, combined with being grounded in that I think that we are eternal pattern beings that interact on these boundaries and all sorts of story arcs with people, but it's not something that can ever be erased, and at the core is the infinite heart, the Helios, the central sun, the infinite heart, the Taurus field, to turn that into a story about an apple, a fallen apple and getting cast out of the Garden of Eden, because you had the knowledge, the apple in the Taurus field. I don't know. Like, again, you can choose, you can choose, stay on the right, straight, narrow path. There's only one path and we'll tell you what to do. Or you can be like, at the end of the day, you're safe and you're celebrated and it's going to be hard, but keep going and integrate and be and resonate what you want to see in the world and get there. And yeah, you can bounce back and forth. Some days are just down days and you're going to be over on that thing and you want to follow all the rules, and then you're going to bounce back, and it's okay, because in my LARP, God loves variety and we're all loved. So anyway, hopefully you got something out of that, and Happy New Year. I wrote my things that I wanted to attract this year, and it was exploring parts of Arkansas. I want to see more of Arkansas. I want to do a road trip with my friends to see some of the mounds in Louisiana and Arkansas. I want to be better about my garden, about being good with rotation, crop rotation, and harvesting things on time and sharing things more with people, which I did, but I didn't have it all together because I was doing so much work, digging and getting everything prepped. And I'm going to sing with friends. I'm going to keep working on my lineage work. And I want to let go of the scarcity part, which is hard because there's multiple times a day I think about it. I'm not saying I'm off putting this out there because I've got it all locked down. I don't. But make some beauty and love. Send some love out to people. And use your gifts. Use your gifts in a good way. All right. Bye-bye.